If someone tells you they have nothing left, would you still stay for one more cup of coffee? On a chilly Saturday afternoon in downtown Chicago, the question hangs invisibly over a quiet little cafe where dozens of blind dates begin and end every weekend. The warm glow from hanging Edison bulbs spills across polished wooden tables, while soft jazz hums beneath the chatter of strangers hoping for unexpected connections. Most people arrive carrying polished smiles and carefully rehearsed stories. Ethan Carter arrives carrying something entirely different. A faded navy jacket with frayed cuffs. A pair of worn brown boots that have been professionally scuffed on purpose. A 10-year-old sedan parked 3 blocks away. Even the inexpensive watch on his wrist has been swapped for the custom Swiss timepiece locked inside his office safe. Nobody looking at him today would ever guess that less than 2 hours earlier he had left the top floor of Carter Dynamics, one of the largest technology companies in America, after approving a business acquisition worth more than $100 million. His assistant had begged him to reconsider. His attorney had warned him that pretending to be broke could invite unnecessary risks. His closest friend simply laughed and called him impossible. But Ethan had reached a point where impossible sounded better than predictable. Every relationship he had tried during the past 5 years had followed the same exhausting script. Somewhere between the first expensive dinner and the discovery of his last name, the conversations always changed. Dreams became requests. Curiosity became calculation. Smiles became negotiations. He no longer knew whether anyone saw the man sitting across the table or only the billionaire whose face occasionally appeared in business magazines. So today, he decided to disappear. The dating profile his friend had created never mentioned Carter Dynamics. It listed him as someone rebuilding his life after losing his consulting business. Nothing technically illegal. Nothing completely true. Just enough to see who remained when success disappeared. Ethan glanced toward the cafe entrance as the small brass bell above. The door chimed. A young woman stepped inside, brushing cold air from her cream-colored sweater. She paused for a second, studying the room before checking her phone. Her blonde hair rested loosely on her shoulders, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned not to expect life to be easy. Her boots were practical instead of fashionable. The canvas tote hanging from her shoulder showed faint streaks of dried blue and green paint. Grace Bennett inhaled slowly before whispering to herself, "Okay, just one coffee. You promised Natalie you wouldn't cancel this one." She smiled nervously and scanned the tables until her eyes settled on Ethan. He stood politely. "Grace." She nodded with a cautious smile. "Ethan, looks like we found each other." She laughed softly. "That's already more successful than my last blind date." They both sat down, and for a brief moment neither spoke. The waitress placed 2 menus on the table before walking away. Ethan noticed Grace studying the prices almost immediately, not with embarrassment, but with responsibility, mentally calculating what she could comfortably afford. It reminded him of something he had not seen in years. Real life. Before she could break the silence, Ethan folded the menu closed. His fingers rested lightly on the edge of the table, as if debating whether to continue at all. Finally, he looked directly into her eyes and offered a small apologetic smile. "Before we order anything," he said quietly, "I think you deserve to know something. I almost didn't come today because, honestly, I'm broke. My business collapsed a few months ago. I'm still trying to figure out what comes next. If that's a deal breaker, I completely understand." The cafe seemed to fade into silence as Grace looked at him without speaking, and for the first time in years, Ethan realized the next few seconds might tell him more about someone's heart than an entire lifetime of luxury ever could. Grace did not answer immediately. Instead, she studied Ethan with the kind of quiet attention that made him unexpectedly uncomfortable. She was not searching for flaws in his clothes or questioning whether his story was believable. She simply looked at his face, as though deciding whether the sadness behind his careful smile was genuine. Then she reached for the menu, glanced at the prices once more, and smiled. "Well," she said softly, "that makes 2 of us who have to be careful today." Ethan blinked. "What do you mean?" She laughed, slightly embarrassed, before pulling a neatly folded $10 bill and several coins from her wallet. "I promised myself I would stay within $12 today. I have groceries to buy tomorrow, and my rent is due next week. So if you are broke, and I am almost broke, maybe we should avoid the fancy sandwiches." Ethan found himself smiling for real. Coffee sounds perfect. And maybe one blueberry muffin if we split it. That sounds like a luxury. Grace grinned. See? We are already negotiating like professionals. When the waitress returned, Grace ordered 2 regular coffees and 1 blueberry muffin with an extra plate. Ethan instinctively reached toward his pocket, then paused, remembering the role he had chosen to play. I should probably warn you, he admitted. I cannot really afford lunch today. Grace waved her hand dismissively. Relax. We are splitting everything. That is what normal people do. The words landed harder than she realized. Normal people. Ethan had spent years surrounded by private dining rooms, executive chefs, and meetings where no one ever glanced at a menu before ordering. Yet somehow this simple conversation over 2 inexpensive coffees felt richer than dinners that had cost hundreds of dollars. As steam curled gently from the mugs, Grace stirred cream into hers before asking, "So what happened?" Ethan lowered his eyes. The consulting business failed. Wrong investments. Bad timing. I spent years building it, and it disappeared faster than I thought possible. None of it described Carter dynamics, but every emotion hidden beneath the words was true. He knew what it felt like to fear failure. Grace nodded without interrupting. That must have been awful. It was. Are you looking for work? Trying. That is brave. Ethan looked up, surprised. Brave. Most people disappear when life falls apart. You still showed up. Her answer lingered between them. Nobody had ever complimented him simply for showing up. She took a small bite of the muffin before speaking again. I wait tables 5 nights a week. She pointed toward the paint stains on her canvas bag. During the day, I take art classes whenever I can afford them. You are an artist? Trying to become one. She laughed at herself. That seems to be the theme today. We are both trying. Ethan noticed the gentle way she described her dreams. There was no self-pity, no resentment. Only determination wrapped in quiet hope. What kind of paintings? He asked. Mostly city streets after it rains. Reflections tell stories people do not notice. Ethan glanced through the cafe window where tiny drops of water still clung to the sidewalk outside. That sounds beautiful. Grace shrugged. Beauty usually hides in ordinary places. The sentence settled deep inside him. He wondered whether she realized she had just described herself. As they continued talking, minutes quietly turned into more than an hour. They spoke about favorite books, old neighborhoods, terrible first jobs, and the best diners in Chicago. Grace never once asked how much money Ethan used to have. She never questioned what kind of car he drove or where he lived. Instead, she asked whether he still enjoyed mornings, whether he had family nearby, and whether losing everything had changed the way he looked at people. Ethan answered more honestly than he intended. For the first time in years, someone seemed interested in the person behind the story instead of the success that usually introduced him. When the bill finally arrived, Grace reached for it before he could move. She slid the folded $10 bill across the table with a cheerful smile. I told you, she said. 2 coffees and half a muffin fit perfectly into my budget. Besides, next time you can buy if things get better. Ethan looked at her in complete silence. She had no idea that the billionaire sitting across from her could have purchased the entire cafe without checking his bank account. Yet the $12 she had just spent on a stranger felt more valuable than any fortune he had ever earned. When they stepped outside the cafe, the late afternoon sun had finally broken through the clouds, turning puddles along the sidewalk into shimmering patches of gold. Grace adjusted the canvas bag on her shoulder and smiled, as though the simple change in weather had made the entire day brighter. Thank you, she said. That was actually fun. Ethan chuckled. I think you are the first person who has ever thanked me for sharing half a blueberry muffin. It was a very good muffin. They laughed together before stopping at the corner where their paths separated. Grace pointed toward the elevated train tracks a few blocks away. I take the train home from there. Ethan nodded toward the opposite direction. I parked a little farther away. She hesitated for only a second. Would you maybe like to meet again sometime? The question surprised him more than it should have. Every instinct told him to say yes immediately. Yet another part of him quietly reminded him that every moment he spent with Grace made the truth more difficult to reveal. Still, he found himself smiling. I would like that very much. They exchanged phone numbers, and as Grace disappeared into the crowd, Ethan stood motionless for another minute, watching until she was completely out of sight. That evening, back inside his penthouse overlooking the Chicago skyline, luxury surrounded him once again. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed millions of sparkling city lights. Original artwork decorated the walls. A grand piano sat untouched near the fireplace. Yet the place felt strangely empty after spending an afternoon inside a modest neighborhood cafe, where 2 cups of coffee had somehow meant more than every executive dinner he had attended that year. His phone vibrated. It was his longtime friend and chief operating officer, Lucas Reynolds. "How did the experiment go?" Lucas asked the moment Ethan answered. Ethan walked toward the window. "Different. Different good or different dangerous?" Ethan smiled to himself. "She paid for the coffee." Silence lingered before Lucas laughed. "You are kidding. She only had $12. And she spent it on you. On us." Lucas became serious. "That sounds like someone worth knowing. Just do not forget why you started this." Ethan looked down at the busy streets nearly 50 stories below. "I know." But for the first time, he was not completely sure. Over the next week, messages between Ethan and Grace became part of his daily routine. They were never dramatic. "Good morning. Hope your shift goes well tonight. Do not forget your interview tomorrow. Good luck with your painting assignment." Somehow those ordinary conversations mattered more than endless emails about stock prices and acquisitions. A few days later, Grace suggested meeting at Lincoln Park on Sunday afternoon because admission to the nearby conservatory was free. Ethan arrived wearing the same inexpensive jacket while Grace carried a small sketchbook tucked beneath her arm. They wandered through flower gardens and quiet walking paths without any schedule pushing them forward. Children laughed somewhere in the distance while couples walked hand in hand beneath towering oak trees. Grace eventually stopped near a peaceful pond where sunlight danced across gentle ripples. She sat on a wooden bench and opened her sketchbook. Ethan noticed dozens of unfinished drawings. Rainy sidewalks, old brick buildings, elderly neighbors sitting on front porches, street musicians beneath train tracks. Nothing famous, nothing glamorous. Just ordinary moments carefully preserved in charcoal and watercolor. "These are incredible," he whispered. Grace smiled shyly. "They are not finished. Maybe they do not have to be." She looked at him thoughtfully before beginning another sketch. "Hold still. Me? You have one of those faces that looks different every time you stop pretending." Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken. For a brief second, he wondered if she somehow knew everything. But Grace only smiled as her pencil moved gently across the page. "You look less worried today," she said. "Maybe because someone reminded me that life keeps moving." "Good," she answered softly. "Because I think you deserve better days." Ethan watched her quietly as the afternoon breeze lifted a few loose strands of her hair. He had planned this entire experience as a simple test, a careful way to separate genuine kindness from hidden ambition. Instead, something unexpected was happening. Every hour spent beside Grace made it harder to remember where the performance ended and where his real heart had quietly begun. The following Monday arrived with 2 completely different worlds waiting for Ethan before sunrise. At 7:30 in the morning, he stood inside the executive boardroom of Carter Dynamics, surrounded by polished glass walls, digital presentation screens, and a dozen senior executives waiting for his decision on a billion-dollar expansion project. He answered questions with his usual confidence, reviewed financial reports, and approved contracts that would shape the company's future for years to come. To everyone around the table, he looked exactly like the disciplined billionaire they had always known. Nobody noticed that every time his phone vibrated silently inside his jacket pocket, his attention drifted for the smallest fraction of a second. When the meeting finally ended, Ethan glanced at the screen. A message from Grace appeared. "My professor finally liked one of my paintings today. It is probably a tiny victory, but I wanted someone to celebrate with." Without thinking, Ethan smiled. "That is not tiny. Congratulations. I knew you could do it." He pressed send before realizing several executives were still walking beside him. Lucas noticed the expression immediately. "You smiled at your phone during a board meeting," he said quietly after everyone else had disappeared into the hallway. "That has never happened." Ethan slipped the phone back into his pocket. "People change." Lucas folded his arms. "Or they fall in love." Ethan looked away instead of answering. Later that evening, he met Grace outside a neighborhood grocery store. She had just finished a late shift at the diner and looked tired, but her eyes brightened the moment she saw him. "You came," she said. "You sounded excited in your message." She laughed. "Because I am. My professor said one of my city reflections finally feels alive. I told you that would happen." She gently nudged his shoulder. You are becoming very encouraging for someone who claims life has been terrible lately. Together they walked slowly through the grocery aisles, comparing prices and laughing over ridiculous cereal boxes. Grace carried a handwritten shopping list folded inside her pocket. Fresh fruit if it was on sale. Eggs, bread, soup, coffee, nothing more. Ethan reached toward a basket of fresh strawberries. Grace smiled apologetically. Not this week. Because they are expensive? Because Grandma loves them, and if I buy them, I will end up giving them all to her. Ethan looked at the small price tag. $4.99. The amount meant almost nothing in his world, yet Grace still chose responsibility over impulse without a second thought. She caught him looking. It is okay, she said with a warm smile. Some things taste even better when you wait for them. The sentence stayed with him long after they left the store carrying 2 modest paper bags. As they reached her apartment building, Grace pointed toward a second-floor window where warm light spilled through floral curtains. My grandmother is probably pretending not to wait for me. Ethan looked up. Does she know about me? Grace laughed softly. She knows I met someone kind. The words settled heavily inside him. Kind. Not successful. Not impressive. Just kind. Grace thanked him for walking her home before disappearing through the front door. Ethan remained on the sidewalk until the light inside the apartment flickered on. He finally turned toward his car with an unfamiliar ache in his chest. The lie that had once seemed harmless was becoming heavier every day. The next morning, Lucas entered Ethan's office carrying a thick folder of documents. You have postponed 3 investor dinners, canceled 2 networking events, and somehow found time to spend an afternoon grocery shopping. Ethan looked up from his desk. You have been keeping track? Someone has to. Lucas placed the folder down. How much longer are you planning to continue this? Ethan remained silent. She still believes you lost everything. Lucas continued. What happens when she learns you never actually did? Ethan walked toward the massive window overlooking Chicago. Below him, thousands of people hurried through another ordinary workday. Somewhere among them, Grace was probably carrying her paint-stained canvas bag, chasing a dream she refused to abandon. I was supposed to test whether someone could love me without money, he said quietly. Instead, I met someone who reminds me who I was before money changed everything. Lucas sighed. Then stop waiting. Because every day you stay silent, the truth becomes more expensive than honesty. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment. Deep inside, he knew Lucas was right. But every memory with Grace had become too precious to risk losing. And for the first time in his carefully controlled life, the billionaire who feared nothing in business was terrified of telling one simple truth. 3 days later, Grace's diner manager surprised the entire evening staff with unexpected news. A prestigious charity gala hosted by Carter Dynamics had requested additional servers for one night, and every employee willing to work would receive double pay plus generous tips. Grace almost declined because she had planned to spend the evening finishing a painting assignment, but the extra money could finally replace the worn winter boots she had been repairing with glue for weeks. By late afternoon, she stood inside the grand ballroom of the historic Lakeshore Hotel, wearing a neatly pressed black server uniform, carefully balancing silver trays while elegant guests drifted beneath crystal chandeliers. Everything around her felt like another universe. Women in sparkling gowns greeted one another with effortless confidence. Men in tailored tuxedos discussed investments, foundations, and international travel as though those things belonged to ordinary conversations. Grace quietly reminded herself that she was only there to do her job. Still, she could not help admiring the breathtaking floral arrangements and towering windows overlooking the Chicago River. During a short break, another waitress whispered excitedly, "Do you know who owns all of this?" Grace smiled politely. "No idea. Carter Dynamics. Their founder is one of the youngest billionaires in America. I heard he almost never attends public events, but tonight he is making a major announcement." Grace nodded without giving it much thought. Billionaires belong to magazine covers, not to her life. She picked up another tray of sparkling water and continued weaving gracefully through the crowded ballroom. At the opposite end of the hotel, Ethan adjusted the cuffs of his custom tuxedo while staring silently at his own reflection. Everything familiar had returned. The expensive watch rested once again on his wrist. The tailored suit fit perfectly. His executive security team waited outside the private suite. Lucas stood nearby fastening his tie. "Last chance," he said quietly. "You can still tell her before she finds out like this." Ethan slowly exhaled. "I tried calling. She was working." "I know." "Then after the speech?" Ethan lowered his eyes. "After the speech." But even as he said the words, something inside him warned that he had already waited too long. Minutes later, soft orchestral music faded as the ballroom lights gently dimmed. Guests turned toward the brightly illuminated stage. Grace happened to be serving drinks near the center aisle when the master of ceremonies stepped confidently to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with a broad smile, "thank you for supporting tonight's education initiative. It is now my privilege to introduce the visionary whose generosity made this evening possible. Please welcome the founder and chief executive officer of Carter Dynamics, Mr. Ethan Carter." Grace froze. The silver tray in her hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy. She looked toward the stage almost absent-mindedly, expecting to see someone she had never met. Instead, Ethan stepped through the curtains wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo, greeted by thunderous applause and dozens of standing guests. Giant screens displayed photographs of him opening technology centers, meeting world leaders, and receiving humanitarian awards. Headlines flashed beside his image: billionaire, innovator, philanthropist, founder, chief executive officer. Grace stared at the stage without blinking. The man smiling politely beneath the bright lights was the same man who had shared half a blueberry muffin, walked through grocery stores comparing prices, admired her sketchbook in the park, and quietly admitted he had nothing left. Around her, guests applauded enthusiastically. Someone beside her whispered, "He built a company worth billions before turning 35. Another added, "People say he is one of the most respected business leaders in the country." Grace barely heard them. Her heart sank under the weight of a single realization. Every conversation, every confession, every hopeful plan they had shared suddenly rearranged itself into something she no longer understood. On stage, Ethan accepted the applause before instinctively searching the crowd. His eyes found Grace almost immediately. Time seemed to stop. She did not look angry. She did not even look surprised anymore. She simply looked heartbroken. The warmth that had always filled her gentle smile quietly disappeared, replaced by silent disbelief. Ethan forgot the carefully prepared speech resting inside his jacket pocket. In that single unbearable moment, none of the cameras, investors, or distinguished guests mattered. The only face he could see was the woman who had once believed him without asking for proof, and he suddenly understood that losing the trust in her eyes would cost more than every dollar he had ever earned. The applause still echoed through the ballroom as Grace slowly lowered the silver tray onto a nearby service station. Around her, guests smiled, cameras flashed, and conversations filled the elegant room once again, but every sound seemed strangely distant. She could still hear Ethan's quiet voice from their first afternoon together. "I am broke." The memory replayed itself beside another one. 2 coffees. 1 blueberry muffin. $12. Every ordinary moment that had once felt honest now seemed wrapped inside a question she had never thought to ask. She turned before Ethan finished his opening remarks and quietly walked toward the employee hallway. Nobody stopped her. Inside the service corridor, the bright ballroom lights disappeared behind heavy double doors, replaced by plain white walls and the soft hum of refrigerators from the catering kitchen. Grace leaned both hands against the stainless steel counter and closed her eyes. She was not crying. She simply felt as though someone had erased the ground beneath her feet. A fellow waitress noticed her pale expression. "Grace, are you all right?" Grace forced a polite smile. "I just need some fresh air." She removed her serving apron, thanked the manager for the opportunity, and quietly left the hotel through the staff entrance. Outside, cool evening air brushed across her face as she began walking without any destination in mind. Several minutes later, the ballroom speech ended far sooner than anyone expected. Ethan answered only a few questions before excusing himself despite the confusion of investors and reporters. Lucas followed him into the hallway. "Where are you going?" "To find Grace." Ethan searched every room on the service floor before reaching the staff manager, the blonde waitress who was serving near the center aisle. He asked anxiously, "Where is she?" The manager hesitated. "She left about 10 minutes ago." Ethan hurried outside just in time to see the nearly empty sidewalk stretching in both directions. She was already gone. He called her phone immediately. It rang once before going to voicemail. He sent a message. "Grace, please let me explain." No reply. Another message followed. "I never wanted to hurt you." Silence. The next morning, Ethan stood outside the diner where Grace usually worked. He arrived before sunrise, carrying nothing except 2 cups of coffee from the same neighborhood cafe where they had first met. At 7 o'clock, the front door opened, but another waitress stepped outside instead. "Can I help you?" she asked. Ethan smiled politely. "Is Grace working today?" The waitress looked uncertain. "She switched shifts." "Do you know when she will be back?" "I am sorry. I really do not." Ethan thanked her and quietly left both coffees on a nearby bench. Across town, Grace sat inside her grandmother Eleanor's small apartment, absent-mindedly turning pages of her sketchbook without drawing a single line. Eleanor watched her carefully from the kitchen table. "You have not touched your paints in 2 days," she observed gently. Grace managed a tired smile. "I am just thinking." "About the young man?" Grace nodded. "He lied." Eleanor remained silent for a moment before asking, "About everything?" Grace stared toward the window. "Not everything. That is what makes it hurt." She remembered his encouragement after her painting class, his excitement when she described ordinary city reflections, the way he had walked her home carrying grocery bags without complaining. Those moments had felt real. Yet every one of them now stood beside a secret so enormous that she no longer knew which memories she could trust. Meanwhile, Ethan returned to his office, but work had become almost impossible. Financial reports remained unread across his desk. During executive meetings, he caught himself staring through the windows instead of listening to presentations. Late that afternoon, Lucas quietly entered the office. "You have canceled every interview this week," he said. Ethan nodded. "None of it matters right now." Lucas sat across from him. "Money cannot repair broken trust." Ethan looked down at the untouched coffee cup beside his laptop. "I know. So what are you going to do?" Ethan slowly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and unfolded something he had carried since the day of their first date. It was the small receipt showing 2 regular coffees and 1 blueberry muffin. Total, $12. He traced the faded ink with his thumb before speaking almost to himself. "This time I am not going to chase her with explanations. I am going to earn back the honesty I should have given her from the beginning, even if it takes longer than it took to build my entire company." The following week unfolded with an unfamiliar rhythm. Ethan stopped trying to force conversations that Grace clearly was not ready to have. He sent only one message every morning, never asking for forgiveness, never asking her to reply. Instead, each message contained a simple truth. "I hope your painting goes well today. I hope your grandmother is feeling better. I am sorry that I chose fear instead of honesty." Days passed without a single response. Even so, he continued writing because, for the first time in his life, he understood that sincerity expected nothing in return. Grace read every message. She simply could not bring herself to answer. Every time his name appeared on her phone, 2 versions of Ethan seemed to exist at once. One was the billionaire standing beneath crystal chandeliers while hundreds of people applauded. The other was the man who had smiled over half a blueberry muffin and listened patiently while she described reflections in rain puddles. She no longer knew which one had been real. One rainy afternoon, Grace accompanied her grandmother Eleanor to a routine medical appointment at the neighborhood clinic. Eleanor had insisted that everything was fine, but Grace knew the arthritis in her hands had become more painful over the past few months. After the examination, the receptionist smiled warmly. "Mrs. Bennett, your balance has already been taken care of." Eleanor looked confused. There must be some mistake. The receptionist checked the computer again. "No mistake. An anonymous donor prepaid the next 6 months of your therapy sessions and medications." Grace frowned. "Who?" The receptionist gently shook her head. "The instructions specifically asked us not to share a name." On the drive home, Eleanor quietly watched her granddaughter staring through the passenger window. "You know who it was," she said softly. Grace lowered her eyes without answering. Later that evening, Ethan visited the clinic after closing hours. He met privately with the administrator only long enough to confirm one condition. "Please," he said, "if Mrs. Bennett or Grace asks again, tell them exactly what you told them today. They deserve help, not obligation." The administrator smiled. Most people want recognition. Ethan shook his head. Recognition is the reason I made mistakes in the first place. As he stepped outside into the cool evening air, his phone rang. Lucas was calling. You disappeared from another investor dinner, Lucas said with a sigh. I know. You cannot keep ignoring your schedule forever. Ethan leaned against his car and looked toward the quiet neighborhood streets. For years I believed solving problems meant writing bigger checks. And now I think the hardest problems can only be solved by becoming a better person. Lucas was silent before answering. That sounds less like a businessman and more like the man Grace believed you already were. Meanwhile, Grace returned to her small apartment and found Eleanor arranging fresh flowers inside an old glass jar. Someone left these outside our door, Eleanor said with a curious smile. There was no card, only a bouquet of simple white daisies tied together with ordinary twine. Grace gently touched the petals before noticing something tucked beneath the ribbon. It was not a letter. It was a folded receipt from a neighborhood grocery store. One item had been circled in blue ink. Fresh strawberries. Grace immediately remembered the afternoon Ethan had quietly reached toward the strawberries before she explained they were outside her budget because she wanted her grandmother to enjoy them instead. Her eyes slowly filled with emotion as she realized the bouquet was not expensive, dramatic, or designed to impress anyone. It simply reminded her that someone had listened to a conversation she had almost forgotten herself. The following Saturday morning, Grace stopped by the local weekend art market to deliver 2 small watercolor paintings to a community display. As she walked between booths filled with handmade crafts and local artists, she unexpectedly saw a familiar figure several yards away. Ethan stood alone beside a modest wooden table, not wearing an expensive suit or speaking to reporters, but quietly helping volunteers unload folding chairs for a free neighborhood art program sponsored anonymously through a charitable foundation. He had not noticed her yet. Grace remained perfectly still, watching him laugh with an elderly volunteer while carrying supplies without introducing himself or expecting anyone to know who he was. For the first time since the gala, she saw something that no headline, no fortune, and no carefully crafted disguise could create. She saw a man choosing kindness even when no one was watching. Grace stood quietly beneath the shade of a maple tree, watching Ethan from across the community art market without letting him know she was there. There were no television cameras following him, no executives standing nearby, and no reporters waiting for a quote. He spent the next hour arranging folding tables, carrying boxes of children's paint supplies into the recreation center, and thanking every volunteer as though they were doing him the favor instead. When one elderly volunteer struggled to lift a stack of canvases, Ethan immediately stepped forward with an easy smile. I have this, he said warmly. You have already done enough today. The woman laughed and patted his shoulder. You always say that. Grace frowned slightly. Always. That single word stayed with her. She quietly approached another volunteer arranging paintbrushes inside glass jars. Excuse me, she asked gently. Does he come here often? The volunteer smiled. Almost every Saturday for the past 4 years. Grace looked back toward Ethan in surprise. Really? Most people never recognize him because he asks everyone not to mention his company. He says this place should belong to the neighborhood, not to a billionaire. Grace felt her heart grow unexpectedly heavy. For years, long before she had ever met him, the volunteer continued arranging supplies while speaking casually. He paid for this entire building after an old art studio closed during the pandemic. Then he disappeared before the ribbon-cutting ceremony because he did not want his name on the front door. Grace slowly turned toward the modest brick building. Above the entrance was a simple wooden sign that read, Lincoln Community Arts Center. Nothing mentioned Carter Dynamics. Nothing mentioned Ethan Carter. For the next several minutes, she silently observed him speaking with young adults, encouraging local artists, and helping clean paint from folding tables. Every smile looked natural. Every conversation felt genuine. She suddenly remembered something Lucas had unknowingly said during the gala while introducing Ethan to investors. He believes innovation begins by giving people opportunities they never imagined. At the time, those words had sounded like polished public relations. Standing here now, they sounded like the truth. Grace finally gathered enough courage to walk toward him. Ethan was stacking empty supply boxes when he sensed someone nearby. He looked up and froze. Neither of them spoke for several long seconds. The busy sounds of the market continued around them, while everything between them seemed suspended in complete silence. Ethan gently set the box down. "Grace." She nodded softly. "Hi." He searched her face carefully. "I was not expecting to see you." "I know." He looked as though he wanted to explain everything again, but stopped himself. Instead, he simply asked, "How is your grandmother?" Grace noticed the question came naturally, without performance or hesitation. "She is doing much better." Ethan smiled with visible relief. "I am glad." Another silence followed before Grace quietly reached into her canvas bag and removed the folded grocery receipt she had found beneath the bouquet of daisies. She held it between them. "You forgot to stay anonymous." Ethan lowered his eyes and smiled faintly. "I was hoping you would never know." "Why?" "Because if you thanked me, it would stop being a gift." Grace studied him for a long moment. "You also paid for Grandma's therapy." Ethan hesitated before answering honestly. "Yes." "Without telling me." "You already believed I used money the wrong way once. I wanted to do something that expected nothing back." Grace looked around the community center where volunteers laughed together while preparing free painting classes for neighborhood families. "How many places like this are there?" Ethan shrugged almost shyly. "More than people realize." "And nobody knows?" "They do not need to." Grace slowly exhaled. The anger she had carried since the gala had not disappeared completely, but something far more important had begun to replace it. Understanding. She finally realized that Ethan had not invented kindness to impress her. The kindness had always existed. The lie had hidden his identity, not his character. She looked directly into his eyes. "You hurt me." Ethan nodded immediately. "I know. I do not know how long it will take before I trust you again." "I understand. But if we ever try again," she continued gently, "there cannot be another hidden life, another invented story, or another test." Ethan met her gaze. Without looking away. "No more tests. No more disguises. No more pretending. If you give me another chance, you will know every part of my life, even the parts one used to hide from everyone." Grace looked at the worn $12 receipt still folded inside her hand and smiled for the first time since the gala. "Then maybe we should start over with the truth this time." 1 year later, the little neighborhood cafe looked almost exactly the same as it had on the afternoon when two strangers first sat across from each other with only enough money for 2 regular coffees and 1 blueberry muffin. The wooden tables had gathered a few more scratches. The jazz music still drifted softly through the room. The brass bell above the front door still greeted every customer with the same cheerful ring. Grace smiled as she stepped inside carrying a familiar canvas tote. Although this one was noticeably cleaner than the paint-stained bag she had carried a year earlier. Life had changed in ways she never imagined. Her paintings now filled the walls of a bright studio downtown, a dream that had finally become reality after months of hard work, local exhibitions, and growing support from the community. Ethan had quietly invested in the building only after Grace agreed to one condition. His name would appear nowhere on the ownership papers, promotional materials, or front entrance. The studio belonged entirely to her. He had kept that promise without hesitation. As she looked around the cafe, she spotted Ethan already waiting at their favorite corner table. This time he wore a simple navy sweater instead of a carefully chosen disguise. There was no expensive watch hidden beneath his sleeve, no invented story prepared in advance, and no fear behind his smile. There was only honesty. When Grace reached the table, Ethan stood and pulled out her chair exactly as he had imagined doing countless times during the year they had spent rebuilding trust one truthful conversation at a time. "You are late," he teased gently. Grace laughed. "By 3 minutes. I counted." "I know you did." They sat together as the same waitress who had served them during their first date approached with a knowing smile. "Let me guess," she said playfully. 2 regular coffees?" Grace looked at Ethan before smiling. "And 1 blueberry muffin with an extra plate." The waitress laughed. Some traditions deserve to stay. As she walked away, Grace reached into her wallet and carefully unfolded something she had carried every day since the gala. The faded $12 receipt rested between them on the table. Time had softened the paper, but the ink remained readable. 2 regular coffees. 1 blueberry muffin. Ethan looked at it with quiet emotion. "You kept it?" Grace nodded. "It reminds me of 2 things." "What are they?" She smiled gently. "First, kindness costs much less than people think. Second, Trust is worth much more than money. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and slowly removed a small velvet box. But instead of opening it immediately, he placed it beside the old receipt. There was a time when I believed success meant building the biggest company I could imagine, he said quietly. Then I met someone who spent her last $12 on a stranger because she believed every person deserved compassion. You changed the way I measure wealth, Grace. Her eyes shimmered with quiet emotion as he opened the box, revealing a simple diamond ring chosen for elegance rather than extravagance. The cafe seemed to fade into the background once again, just as it had during their first conversation. Ethan reached across the table and gently held her hand. I cannot promise that life will always be easy, he said. But I can promise that there will never be another disguise, another hidden truth, or another test. I want to build every tomorrow with complete honesty. Grace Bennett, will you marry me? For a moment, she simply looked at him, remembering every step that had brought them back to this table. The shared muffin, the rainy walks, the painful revelation, the quiet acts of kindness that expected nothing in return, the slow rebuilding of trust through truth instead of promises. Finally, she smiled the same warm smile that had first convinced a lonely billionaire to believe in people again. Yes, she whispered, but only if we keep coming back here every year. Ethan laughed softly. That is the easiest promise I will ever make. As the waitress returned with 2 fresh cups of coffee, she noticed the ring and quietly placed the blueberry muffin between them with an even bigger smile. Outside, the afternoon sunlight reflected across the sidewalk exactly the way Grace loved to paint it. Inside, 2 ordinary cups of coffee, 1 shared blueberry muffin, and an old $12 receipt quietly reminded them that the greatest fortunes are never measured by bank accounts. They are measured by honesty earned, kindness returned, and a love strong enough to choose the truth every single day.